Next, I want to review the different biome types that we've covered, including the maps and some notes on the type of vegetation that we find there. So one thing to note for the exam is that you will have some questions where you need to match names and vegetation types to these maps that we used for the map quiz. So this is if you however you did on the map quiz, you should study those maps again because they will be on the exam. So this is the tropical rainforest and savanna biomes here near the equator. And the tropical rainforest, as we've mentioned, is the most biologically diverse amongst all the biomes. So they consist of rainforests with broadleaf evergreen trees. So trees that are, the various diverse types of trees with a very complex structure. And then savannas, kind of the lighter shade here, are grasslands with scattered trees. So as we've mentioned, rainforests are the most biologically diverse amongst the biomes. And we talked a little bit about the soil as well. Tropical savanna environments are more grasses and scattered trees. And one thing we mentioned about grasslands is they are transitional zones between forests and deserts. So as you move away from the dense tropical forest, you transition into areas that are called savannas, which are a bit drier, like the savanna climate is the driest of the tropics. And then eventually you transition into drier desert environments. One thing about grasslands is they support what we call megafauna, or large animals such as zebras or even bison in the mid-latitudes. And one reason is because they have area to move around in grasslands, that grasslands provide a lot more mobility than dense tropical forests. Okay, next are deserts and steppe, or mid-latitude grasslands. And one thing we talked about with deserts is that they have xerophytic vegetation, which are desert adapted species, and steppe or mid-latitude grasslands. So this is the map for the deserts in the darker color, and the steppe environments, which are the lighter color, like the Central Valley here, or the Great Plains, or the Russian steppe. So again, deserts have plants that are xerophytically adapted. This means that they can survive in a water-limited environment like a desert. They have adaptations like storing water in their bodies or having deep roots which could tap into the water table. And they need these adaptations to survive in the dry climate. Steppe environments are grasslands. And again, grasslands are transitional areas between deserts, and next will be mid-latitude forests. Steppe can have both short and tall grasses, short grasses in areas that are drier and tall grasses in areas that are wetter. So here is a somewhat drier steppe environment with short grasses, very short. And this is a wetter steppe environment with taller grasses. So the wetter environments the tall grasses are essentially in the wetter parts of the environments, or the wetter areas. Also, we talked a little bit about other freshwater communities that you find within grasslands, and one unique one in California are called vernal pools. These are depressions in the ground that seasonally fill with water, and in Mediterranean environments, that's during the winter time, and then by summer they become dry. These red areas are vernal pools around the Central Valley, and they're home. This is what they look like in the wintertime when they fill up, and by summer they're dry. And they are home to a lot of unique plants and animals that are adapted to that seasonal cycle. So for example, there are types of invertebrates or small shrimp-like creatures that can survive during the dry summer and then come back to life in the winter when the water's there again. Okay, next is Mediterranean. And the two key species is especially this one, is chaparral. Chaparral are drought-resistant shrubs, and these are the most associated with the Mediterranean environment. But we also have oak woodlands in California as well, and other places. These are grasslands with scattered trees. So make sure you know the Mediterranean. I also know that is associated with chaparral in particular. So this is what chaparral looks like. These are drought-resistant shrubs. And these are pictures of oak woodlands. The oak woodlands should look somewhat familiar if you've driven not too far out of the valley towards up into the mountains. You will see environments that look like this. This is the Mediterranean. This is what the Mediterranean zone in the Sierra Nevada looks like. Next, we have temperate or mid-latitude mixed forest. Temperate and mid-latitude mean the same thing. And here you have a mix of both deciduous trees and conifer trees. That's why it's mixed. So both these, what we call hardwood or deciduous or softwood or coniferous trees, depending on the local conditions such as soils. So the darker color are more coniferous, the lighter color are more broadleaf or deciduous. So here's a picture of each type. Probably the best associated type of vegetation are deciduous trees. These are broadleaf trees that lose their leaves in the winter because now outside of the tropics, you do have more seasonality. And so this is a seasonal adaptation to shed their leaves in the fall. Next is our coniferous or boreal forest. And this is what we find associated with our D climates at high latitudes in the northern hemisphere. And these are dominated by softwood or coniferous trees exclusively because they are better adapted to surviving the very cold winters that you find in these continental climates. So here the trees are adapted to the severe winters of the D climates. And also at high latitudes as well, because it cannot just be high latitudes and also at high elevations as well. It's not only at, near the poles, but also at high elevation. They go by different names. They're called boreal forest in Canada, and they're called the taiga in Russia. And lastly, we have our tundra, polar, and highland group. These are found near the poles. The white represents ice. Ice is not a biome itself, but I'm trying to just include that with the rest of them, including some highland areas as well. And the primary vegetation here is tundra, sort of this lighter color up here. Tundra areas that are too cold for trees, so they have other types of vegetation. So what type of vegetation is missing from this photo? We went over this in climates as well. It is missing trees because it is too cold. You find them at high latitudes and also at high elevations.